Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Everyman's Thoughts. Spoiler alert, today I break down episode 5 from season 1 of Rings of Power, so you've been warned. With that, let's get started.
Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Although I normally lead with the main character Galadriel, today I want to start with the dinner party between DURIN and the elves, as it leads into a bigger point I wanted to make. If you recall, last week King DURIN told his son to meet with the elves and see what they're up to. In fairness to the king, it had been 20 years and the elves did show up asking for a favor. We move forward to this week and the dinner party, and as usual, the show continues its tradition of beautiful set designs. I've said it many times, in terms of set design and panoramics and musical accompaniment, this show is as good as anything I've ever seen. Unfortunately, the show also continues its tradition of squandering all of that brilliant effort with questionable writing and befuddling storylines. As the dinner party continues, Gil-galad, one of the most accomplished and distinguished beings who have ever lived, can't get out a simple dinner party question without it being awkward and disrespectful. Prince DURIN takes umbrage and responds in kind. All goodwill and diplomacy is now quickly evaporating until Elrond steps in and rectifies the situation. Shortly after dinner, we learn that the dwarven suspicions were accurate. Unbeknownst to Elrond, High King Gil-galad either knew or had a strong suspicion that the dwarves had discovered Mithril. Furthermore, Gil-galad informs Elrond that their entire race is dying and their only hope for survival is to obtain vast quantities of Mithril. Beyond that, he even asks Elrond to break his sacred oath of silence with the dwarves so they could discuss the issue openly, presumably to negotiate for Mithril. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to skip over a lot of the nitpicky stuff, like the fact that the dwarves live underground and there hadn't been any contact with the elves in decades. So how did Gil-galad know that their forges were burning brighter than ever or about the Mithril in the first place? This was even a secret amongst the dwarves. Instead, I want to focus on considerably more important issues like oath-breaking and how the character of Gil-galad is being portrayed. If you're a Tolkien fan and you've read the works and are willing to admit the truth regardless of how it reflects upon the show, then you know Gil-galad asking Elrond to become an oathbreaker is outrageous. Throughout every age of Middle-earth, we consistently see how sacred and powerful the legendarium considered oaths to be. In the Oath of Fëanor, which was referenced in the very first episode of this show, elves were driven to commit vile acts that they explicitly did not want to do just to uphold their oaths. Maglor even specifically states that the price of breaking that bond would be eternal darkness. In this very series, DURIN tells Elrond how serious this oath is. In turn, Elrond tells Gil-galad that breaking his oath would sacrifice his soul.
I swore an oath to DURIN. To some, that may now hold little weight. But in my esteem, it is by such things our very souls are bound.
In Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship is forming, Elrond doesn't want any oaths to be sworn because he knows the power behind them. Later in the series, we see the fate of the dead men whose souls were damned for eternity because they were oath breakers until they were finally redeemed by aiding Aragorn. At the very end, Sam swore an oath to Frodo, which is why it's such a big deal that he carried him up the mountain. Time and again, we see the power behind swearing an oath, the seriousness with which people made those oaths, the consequences for breaking those oaths, and that people knew with certainty that there would be consequences for breaking them. If your guide is supposed to be the original source material, then a character of Gil-galad's statue asking Elrond to become an oathbreaker is inconceivable. Don't tell me this is a, quote, love letter to Tolkien, their words not mine, when you are willing to haphazardly abandon fundamental tenets of his writings. Earlier I mentioned I also wanted to talk about the portrayal of the character of Gil-galad. You may have also noticed that when I referred to High King Gil-galad, I also used phrases like distinguished, accomplished, or an elf of his stature. There's a reason for that. At this point, he is the elf. more so even than Galadriel or Celebrimbor, who will later go on and establish their own kingdoms. He is easily considered one of the greatest elves and leaders in all of the Legendarium. He could accurately be described as courageous, wise, and just. But is this the character we're being given in Rings of Power? He was deceitful and manipulative when he sent Galadriel off to Valinor. He was deceitful and manipulative again when he sent Elrond to Khazad-dûm. And he was deceitful and disingenuous again in his dealings with the dwarves when Durin arrived in Lindon. Much like Galadriel, the character is almost the exact opposite of what you would expect from the books for no good reason. From an outsider's perspective, it looks like these changes were made just because it made it easier to go from point A to point B in your story, and you weren't willing to put forth the wherewithal to do it right. On a more positive note, I really liked the mithril origin or creation story. The pure-hearted elf versus the evil Balrog, light and darkness pouring into the tree and thereby traveling into the earth. Of all of the new elements they've added to the story, I think this is probably the only one thus far that I felt feels right, belongs there. Sadly, it is probably a one-off and something we won't see referenced again. I also continue to enjoy the character of Durin IV. He's one of the few characters that's well written and feels like he actually belongs in Middle-earth. I think it's safe to say that many of us were excited for the dwarves even before the show premiered, so let's hope the mithril storyline increases their screen time. Let's move on to the hobbits. The fake hobbits were clearly added for comedic relief, but for me, the comedy just isn't landing except for when Sadoc Burrows gets browbeat by his wife.
He's responsible, isn't he? The big fella.
What precisely do you expect me to do about it?
What you ought to have done at the camp. Take their wheels and leave them.
You really have to appreciate how self-interested and psychopathic this lady is. At present, the hobbits are still amidst one of their seasonal migrations to a new camp. What's weird here is the length of the migration based on the map and images shown during the song feels like it would take considerably more than the entire season just to get to the new location, so what's the point? But I want to talk about a few things that have a little more meat to them. Did you notice how much overt magic the stranger was using? First he slams the ground and throws the wolves back, then he freezes the water ostensibly as some kind of healing ritual. Magic in Middle-earth is usually a little more subtle than this, but the stranger is obviously still out of sorts in finding his way, so I don't think we can fault them for showing him having difficulty managing his powers, so to speak. In fact, I think the writers did kind of a good job here showing that his magic actually comes at a cost. We could see how serious the wound was after he slammed the ground. This is a nice counterbalance effect to prevent him from being infinitely powerful. We also had the first appearance of priests or religious cultists apparently tracking down the stranger. I know a lot of us assumed these were going to be Numenorian worshippers dedicated to Morgoth, but that's not the case. Also, if you look closely, one of the priestesses is holding a disc with a symbol that looks like a constellation. Obviously, stars and astral symbols have been associated with the stranger straight from the start. This scene is an excellent example of one of the show's main recurring problems. There are so many unnecessary characters that they frequently do things like this, where they offer you a small tidbit and then abruptly move on. They think they're building suspense, but in truth, you haven't had enough content to become emotionally invested in the characters. It's not exactly a big leap of faith to say that this lack of character development is why so many people refer to the show as boring or uneventful. Thus far, the hobbits have been completely superfluous, and it would be nice to reinvest that screen time into something that might entice the fans. Next, we'll do the Southlands because it had the only thing about this episode that I found interesting. We open with Solaire from Dark Souls, Adar, staring into the sun, appreciating its warmth and beauty. Adar mentions to his orc companion that he wishes the orcs could appreciate the sun the way that he does, and most importantly, that he's going to miss it. This is a strong suggestion that he's either going to go deep underground, block the sun, or destroy it outright. If this seems ridiculous or grandiose, remember, Mr. Burns was able to pull it off. Also, if you recall, in Middle-earth, Morgoth did destroy the two trees, which were essentially the sun and the moon of the time. But Morgoth is a god, you say. Well, A, Morgoth actually used the spider demon Ungoliant to destroy the trees. And B, in last week's episode, Adar implied that he was on the path to becoming a god. As usual, and as I said earlier, Amazon just gives us a little bite without giving us something to sink our teeth into. As far as the people of the Southlands, they're still facing an impossible choice. Either fight a hopeless battle or submit to somebody who you're being told is pure evil. I thought the writers did a good job here having a large number of the people defecting and being willing to submit. Because this is a TV show, we probably have been too ingrained or ingratiated with the trope of overcoming impossible odds, but imagine this scenario from their perspective. They have no food. They appear to have only one real warrior, Arondir the elf, who many of them likely resent because of their regrettable shared history. None of them have met Adar yet, so they have no way to gauge how vile he is, and they have an old man yelling to them that, you know what, it's not going to be that bad. Plus, the elves have been lording over these people for generations, so in their mind it's just trading one master for another. And let's be honest, Bronwyn's speech wasn't exactly compelling. With all this in mind, to me, it's very realistic that so many people would have chosen to submit in the hopes that they could just bend the knee and then immediately return to their daily lives. I'd even go so far as to say it's the people that chose to stay who are being unrealistic. You're out of food. The people who left know you're out of food, so the orcs don't even have to attack. They can simply wait you out. I'm certainly not saying they have to submit, but they can just leave. They have a few days head start on people who can't travel in the sun, and an experienced sylvan elf to lead them through the wild to a safer place. As the weeks come, we'll see what decision these people make. Shortly thereafter in the episode, Uncle Touchy and friends reach Adar and attempt to swear fealty. If you noticed, Adar becomes visibly upset when he's referred to as Sauron. Back at the tower, the reality of the situation is starting to sink in, people are getting desperate, and Theo decides to trust Arondir with the hilt of the sword. Now, Arondir has been around for a long time. He knows the history of the tower and remembers it from years gone by. Arondir then cleans some vines from the tower walls to reveal an ominous statue that is wielding a sword very similar to the one Theo just gave him. At this point, Arondir surmises that the weapon is central to Adar's plan and perhaps a key to unlocking something powerful or some form of power, maybe even allowing him to become a demigod like we referenced earlier. Furthermore, they also know that the enemy is aware that the weapon is in the tower. With this new variable now added to the equation, it now makes less sense than ever to stay and fight. Given the mediocre writing thus far, we probably all assume that plot armor is going to happen, but I would be absolutely impressed if they actually had these people flee. Saying something like, yeah, some of us may die, but a lot of us have a good chance to live, and we're going to frustrate our enemy in getting his hands on the secret weapon. Taking a step back, though, I did find the sword relic and the statue interesting. Like many people, I enjoy exploring history, even fictional ones, and the story behind the sword could add much needed depth to the people of the Southlands. Alright, and let's finish up with Galadriel and Numenor. We pick up in Numenor with the island continuing its preparations for war in the Southlands. Isildur presses his father for a place on the expedition, but his father very correctly points out Isildur's done nothing with his life. Other men have served honorably and earned their place on the ship. I sense a wacky scheme, because that wouldn't be tried at all. Next, we see Halbrand summoned to the Queen to help her and Galadriel form the Numenorian battle strategy. Odd that the two people who have given the Queen no reason to trust them and who were in fact in jail just a few hours ago are now giving Numenorian battle plans. Odder still is the Queen asking Halbrand where does the enemy head next. He has no possible way of knowing where his enemy is, who his enemy is, what his enemy's possible motivations might be, and yet without hesitation he immediately calls out the perfect place for the Numenorian army to attack. Just when you think it can't possibly get any worse, the Queen agrees to continue with this nonsense, even though it's painfully obvious Galadriel is lying to her and Halbrand wants no part of the plan. This was frustrating to watch. Up until now, Muriel has been presented as a smart, cool-headed leader, and there's no way a woman of her intelligence would go along with this scheme once she realizes who she's in bed with. Now, Pharazôn, on the other hand, I get. When his son presses him about why he's going against the mob, he talks about building a vassal kingdom and building an empire. Okay, fine. But none of these are Muriel's reasons. Her primary motivation is to reconnect with the elves. Why start a war that you know is going to infuriate your people, could possibly have disastrous consequences, especially when you have no guarantee that you're even going to meet other elven leaders like Gil-galad? Instead, placate your people by telling them you're sending Galadriel away and send her home. Send a couple of dignitaries to accompany her, that way they may enter diplomatic negotiations with other elven leaders upon her arrival. I was doubly disappointed with all this because this is exactly what happened in Wheel of Time as well. Otherwise smart, strong characters knowingly allowed someone to lie to them repeatedly, but still allowed that same liar to lead them around by the nose. Moving on, there are two more scenes I want to talk about before we wrap this up. The first is the infamous scene where Galadriel teaches the Numenorian recruits how to sword fight. I know a lot of people have made fun about this scene, but I didn't hate it as much as everybody else did. When you hear the marketing team talk incessantly about strong female characters, you know somewhere muscly men are going to get beat up. But this scene was done about as well as we could expect. Although in the books the Numenorian army is quite skilled, these were mere recruits, and she beat them exactly how you'd expect she might beat them, with experience, agility, and grace. The final scene I want to talk about is the ship exploding in the harbor. Once again, a beautiful scene whose writing didn't live up to its promise. The city's on edge over the Queen's decision to go to war, the tension's palpable. Then one of the expedition ships inexplicably blows up in the harbor. Two people are seen in close proximity to the ship, one with an alibi that doesn't bear scrutiny. They say that Pharazôn's son was on a fishing boat in the middle of the night and nobody questions this. First question should have been, why were you on a fishing boat in the middle of the night? Second question is, where is this fishing boat? The ships are burning, but they don't sink immediately. It's these continual opportunities that the show keeps missing that plague the series week after week after week. Instead of being something that looked amazing and was really cool, this is going to make my top 10 dumbest scenes of season 1 list. Anyway, I don't want to keep nitpicking. That's it for me this time, guys. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like or subscribe button, and I will see you next time.